Chapter 30 of The Copper Princess. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read by Betsy Bush. October 2009. The Copper Princess by Kirk Munroe. Chapter 30. Peveril Inquires an Unshared Interest. An autumn evening 2 years later finds Richard Peveril seated in the smoking-room of the university, the most thoroughly home-like and comfortable of all New York clubs. He has dined alone, and now, with a tiny cup of black coffee on the stand beside him, is reflectively smoking his after-dinner cigar. This is his first visit to the East since he left it, more than 2 years before, almost penniless and well-nigh friendless, on a search for a mine that he was assured would prove worthless when found. To-day that same mine is yielding an enormous revenue, on which he receives 1/4, or a sum vastly in excess of his simple needs, for he is still a bachelor, acting as manager of the Copper Princess, and still makes his home in the little mining settlement on the shore of the great Western Lake. A fortune twice as large as his own, and derived from the same source, lies idle in the vaults of a trust company, awaiting a claimant who cannot be found. Her name is Mary Darrell, and though from the very first Peveril has guarded her interests more jealously than his own, and though he has made every effort to discover her, her fortune still awaits its owner. He has not only been disappointed at the non-success of his efforts in this direction, but is deeply hurt that the girl, who has been so constantly in his thoughts during his 2 years of loneliness, should so persistently ignore him. That she has occupied so great a share of his time for thinking is due largely to the fact that there is no one else to take a like place, for Rose Bonnifay long since released him from his engagement to her, and he has contracted no other. As soon as he believed his fiancée to be in New York, he wrote her a long letter descriptive of his good fortune and promising very soon to rejoin her for the fulfilling of his engagement. To his amazement it was promptly returned to him, endorsed on the outside in Miss Bonnifay's well-known handwriting. "As my last to you came back to me unopened, I now take pleasure in returning yours in the same condition." He immediately wrote again, only to have his second letter treated as the first had been, except that this time it came to him without a word. From that day he had heard nothing further from Rose Bonnifay. Now business had called him to New York, and he had reached the city but an hour before his appearance at the club. Here he gazed curiously about him, as one long strange to such scenes, but who hopes to discover the face of a friend in that of each newcomer. Thus far he had not been successful, nor had he been recognized by any of the men, many of them in evening dress, who came and went through the spacious rooms. Peveril was also in evening dress, for he had conceived a vague idea of going to some theatre, or possibly to the opera, and now he listlessly glanced over the advertised list of attractions in an afternoon paper. While he was thus engaged, a young man, faultlessly apparelled and pleasing to look upon, stood in front of him, regarded him steadily for a moment, and then grasped his hand, exclaiming, "If it isn't old Dick Peveril, come to life again after an age of burial! My dear fellow, I am awfully glad to see you. Where have you been, and what have you been doing all these years? Heard you had gone west to look up a mine, but never a word since. Hope you found it, and that it turned out better than such properties generally do. Was it gold, silver, iron, or what?" "You may imagine its nature from its name," answered Peveril, who was genuinely glad to meet again his old college friend, Jack Langdon. "It is called the Copper Princess." "The Copper Princess!" cried the other. "By Jove, you don't say! Why, that mine is the talk of Wall Street, and if you are any part in it, you must be a millionaire." "Not quite that," laughed Peveril, "though I am not exactly what you might call poor." "I should say not, and only wish I stood in your shoes. But you see—" Here Langdon plunged into a long account of his own affairs, to which Peveril listened patiently. Finally the former said, "By the way, what have you on hand for to-night?" "Nothing in particular. Was thinking of going to some theatre." "Don't you do it. Beastly shows, all of them. Nothing but vaudeville nowadays. Come with me, and I'll take you to a place where you will not only have a pleasant time, but will meet old friends as well. You remember old Owen? Dig Owen, we used to call him." "Yes." "Well, he is here in New York, and has made a pot of money, no one knows how, shady speculations of some kind, and between ourselves it is liable to slip through his fingers at any moment. But that's neither here nor there. He married about a year ago, a nice enough girl who has apparently lived abroad all her life, rather a light-weight, but entertains in great shape. Always has something good on hand, generally music. They give a blow-out to-night, to which I am going to drop in for a while, and, of course, they will be delighted to see you. So don't utter a protest, but just come along." In accordance with the programme thus provided, Peveril found himself an hour later entering the drawing-room of a spacious mansion on Upper Fifth Avenue. It was already so well filled that it was some time before the newcomers could approach their hostess. When they finally reached the place where she was talking and laughing with a group of guests, her face was so averted that Peveril did not see it until Langdon had said, "Good evening, Mrs. Owen. You have gathered together an awfully jolly crowd, and I have taken the liberty of adding another to their number. He is an old college friend of your husband's, and quite a lion just now, and he is the owner of the famous Copper Princess that every one is talking about. May I present him? Mrs. Owen, my friend Mr. Richard Peveril." From this Langdon stepped aside, and Peveril found himself face to face with Rose Bonnifay. For an instant she was deadly pale. Then, with a supreme effort, she recovered her self-possession, the blood rushed back to her cheeks, and, extending her hand with an engaging smile, she said, "This is indeed an unexpected pleasure, Mr. Peveril, and I am ever so much obliged to Mr. Langdon for bringing you. Did he know, I wonder, that you were an old friend of mine as well as of Mr. Owen's? No? Then the surprise is all the pleasanter. Oh, there is mamma, and she will be delighted to meet you again. Mamma, dear, here is our old friend Mr. Peveril. So pleased, and hope we shall see you often this winter." Other newly arrived guests demanding Mrs. Owen's attention at this moment, Peveril found himself borne away by her mother, who had greeted him effusively, and now seemed determined to learn everything concerning his Western life to its minutest details. To accomplish this she led him to a corner of the conservatory for what she was pleased to term an uninterrupted talk of old times, but which really meant the propounding of a series of questions on her part and the giving of evasive answers on his. While Peveril was wondering how he should escape, a hush fell on the outer assembly, and some one began to sing. At first sound of the voice the young man started and listened attentively. "Who is she?" he asked. "Nobody in particular," responded Mrs. Bonnifay. "Only a girl whom Rose met when she was studying music in Germany. I fancy she spent her last cent on her musical education, which, I fear, won't do her much good after all, for, as you must notice, she is utterly lacking in style. She is dreadfully poor now, and earns a living by singing in private houses, all her voice is really fit for, you know. So Rose takes pity on her, and has her in once in a while. Why, really, they are giving her an encore. How kind of them! And yet they say the most wealthy are the most heartless. But you are not going, Mr. Peveril. I haven't asked you half." Peveril was already out of the conservatory and making his way towards the piano, as though irresistibly fascinated. For her encore, the singer was giving a simple ballad that had been very popular some years before. The last time Peveril heard it was when cruising along a shore of Lake Superior, and it had come to him from somewhere up in the red-stained cliffs. At last he had found Mary Darrell, his Mary, as he called her, in quick resentment of the smiling throng about him who paid her to sing for them. He did not speak to her then, nor allow her to see him, but when, with her task finished, she left the room, his eyes followed her every movement, and lingered lovingly on her beautiful face, for it was beautiful. He knew it now, as he also knew that he loved her, and always had done so from the moment that he first beheld her, a vision of the cliffs. When, accompanied by faithful Aunty Nimmo, she left the house, he was waiting outside. She tried to hurry away as he approached her, but at the sound of his voice she stood still, trembling violently. An hour later, in the modest apartment far downtown, which was the best her scanty earnings could afford, he had told his story. Mary Darrell knew that she was no longer a poor struggling singer, but an heiress to wealth greater than she had ever coveted in her wildest dreams. But to this she gave hardly a thought, for something greater, finer, and more desirable than all the wealth of the world had come to her in that same brief space of time. She knew that she was loved by him whom she loved, for he had told her so. Even now he stood awaiting, with a trembling eagerness, for answer to his plea. Could she not love him a little bit in return? Would she not go back with him as his wife to the house that had been hers and still awaited her by the shores of the great lake? "But I thought, Mr. Peveril, I heard that you were engaged." "So I was. I was engaged to Mrs. Owen, at whose house you sang this evening, and where I was so blessed as to find you. But she thought me unworthy and let me go. I know I am unworthy still, but, Mary dear, won't you give me one more chance? Won't you take me on trial?" "Well, then, on trial," she answered, though in so low a tone that he barely caught the words. In another instant he had folded her in his arms, for he knew that she was wholly his, and that in this Copper Princess his interest was unshared. End of Chapter 30. End of The Copper Princess, A Story of Lake Superior Mines, by Kirk Munroe.